and welcome to the One More Thing podcast. I am Dr. Troy Doucet, and I am joined today with Pastor Brett Watson. What's going on, man?
Glad to be here.
Good to have you, bro. So this Sunday, it's been a while, man, since we had a little chat. Well, we chat all the time, but since we've had an official chat of One More Thing. So you and Pastor Larry closed out the Summer at the Lake series in a dialogue setting, which I thought was fabulous, man. I thought having that dynamic between you guys was awesome.
Thanks.
And the energy you had, but more importantly, I think the information that you guys shared was something that was really, really thought-provoking and something that was applicable to our lives. So I'm going to kind of grill you on some questions, ask you for some clarification, and
let me have it.
So the scripture you guys used was one that even Jesus' disciples themselves had a misunderstanding about. Explain what that scripture is and what it entails and what Jesus is trying to communicate.
It was from Matthew 16, and it was just Jesus realizing that he was coming to the end of his ministry and wanting to warn his disciples that they should beware of certain things, and that particular thing he described as the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees.
Yeah.
And they thought that he was talking about bread because they forgot to get bread in town when they set out for the countryside. So
That's right. And in the Jewish tradition, it was typical to not put yeast in any of their
especially for religious festivals like the Passover. Still today, practicing Jews will clear their house of all hints of yeast. That's part of the Passover practice, and that's because yeast in the scriptures usually symbolizes sin or things that are problematic. So
and so what was it about this yeast of the Sadducees and Pharisees that would infect like the teachings of Jesus? Like how did Jesus, in your interpretation, how did Jesus see it then? And what are the implications for us now? Is there still yeast that we may need to clear our houses out of?
Oh, yeah. History repeats itself, right? I mean, so the yeast that he was referring to was, in essence, the religious system that kept people oppressed, so that you either were in or you were out.
Mm-hmm.
And so the system was set up to keep the people that were in power in their place, and to keep the rest kind of at arm's length at best.
Mm-hmm.
So systems of do's and don'ts. We mentioned in the sermon that the Pharisees had 613 rules that they tried to keep, and all that was brought about, looking at the law of Moses and trying to interpret that and how it applied. So again, even today, Orthodox Jews won't even press a button in an elevator
On the Sabbath,
on
right?
the Sabbath,
That's
right. So all these rules that kept you in right standing with God. And so Jesus was saying, you have to watch for these things. Otherwise, you'll find yourself infected by that yeast as well. So that yeast today manifests in a lot of ways within the church. Mm-hmm. We try not to be overly critical, but you can see this plain as day in a number of different traditions, denominations, whatever you want to say, but where a new set of rules have been established, but it's the same old game.
Yes.
You're either in or you're out.
That's right.
And that's why we tried to emphasize on Sunday that we don't have a belief statement per se. We have principles that we go by, but we don't have specific beliefs because, as Pastor Larry said, if you question me about my beliefs today, those may change somewhat by tomorrow.
That's right.
Because we're dealing with esoteric things. When we're talking about God, we're talking about transcendent things.
That's right.
Transcendent to this reality as we typically experience it, right?
That's right.
So to pretend that you have these locked in absolutes about something that transcends this reality is really, when you think about it, it's just kind of
It's kind of narcissistic, right?
It is. Yeah, it really is.
And Scripture seems to warn us to not think too highly of ourselves when we attempt these interpretive, hermeneutic understandings of what the transcendental being is, right? God. So I like the way you said that, because here at Suncoast, like, we don't really criticize any other ministry, denomination, tradition, and what they're doing. We kind of go, hey, we think we have a new way of understanding God that is more in line with what we think the Scripture is illuminating about this being. And that was point number one, which was brilliant, where you guys said the best way to criticize what we believe is bad, the yeast, is to actually practice what is better. In other words, there is in philosophy, we call it the ontological piece, right? The piece of how we live.
Yes.
Whereas most belief statements, most doctrines and creeds are what we call epistemic ideas, right? They're mental.
Right.
But yet the way we live matters most, it seemed like, from that point. Can you kind of explain that? What does it mean that the best way to critical what we see in the world as being bad, whether we're talking about statements, beliefs, is to live the better?
So I like what Richard Rohr says about this, that as human beings, we typically, when we're confronted with change, we resist it through either fight or flight. You know?
Mm-hmm.
You can see it in your own life. We typically resist change. And so what happens in religious systems is they get set up, they want to have order, and they establish boundaries, or the walls of the garden, if you will, whatever metaphor you want to use, that gives them the sense of order. And whenever something confronts that order, there's typically a reaction to either fight or run away. In fight mode, you are you're resisting by exactly that. And so the third way, that's different from the fight or flight, is the way that Jesus taught, in the way that we're called to actually live our lives. So the practice of the better is really more about resisting the temptation to fight.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we try not to be critical of the yeast that we see so pervasive in the church today, but to be more about to create an environment of dialogue, and then also to live out the principles that we see Jesus teaching. You notice in the Gospels, there's no list of doctrinal points that Jesus gives us, right?
No.
There's nothing like that throughout all of Jesus' teachings. He's always just principle-based, because he understands that there's no way that you can create a rule for every single nuance of life. It just doesn't work. So he was wise that way, obviously, and he passes that on to us. But it's just funny how the church has slipped into that fight or flight mode, despite
that is interesting.
The obvious teachings of Jesus. You know,
it's funny, man. In my philosophy class, I'll always sort of say this as like a precursor to all of the different thinkers we're going to read. I say every one of these people are attempting to create a universal, absolute ethical law or philosophical law that applies to all people, all places, all times. And I said, but here's the spoiler. None of them do it. And that's our job in philosophy, is to kind of see where their arguments fall short. And it's funny here, even
that's why philosophy is so important.
Oh, it's a way to think properly, and I think that's what we're attempting to do, or at least what Jesus was trying to tell the guy: beware this yeast, because it can cause your way of thinking about things, about God, to be altered in such a way. It's funny, like yeast is often in alcoholic, beverages that cause your mind to be altered in certain ways. So it could be a good analogy there. But then you guys went into something that I thought again was absolutely fabulous when you said that thinking has a way of affecting our living, right?
Yeah.
And vice versa. Explain that point. Give us some more clarity on what you guys were trying to
Right. So
elucidate there.
The point was actually the latter that you said there.
Yeah, living.
That living affects the way we think.
Yeah.
And that's true. And it's also true that thinking affects the way we live. So let's be real about that. What comes first often is
that's
a thought, right? Or you're reacting to something, you get a thought and you change the way you live. But what this point really is about is being intentional about your living. So you practice the things that you see, for Christians, it would be the example of Jesus. And by doing that, even if it flies in the face of your human desires, your comfort zone, do it anyway. And by doing those things, you will test whether or not they're true.
That's right.
That's how you find out.
That's right.
If this thing is, if Jesus is worth his salt, that's the only way to do it, really, when you think about it.
That's right. It's funny, man, because like Jesus never says anywhere, hey guys, these things I'm telling you, these teachings, these parables, I want you every Sunday to gather and talk about these things. That's what I want you to do. I want you to gather everyone on Sunday and we're going to talk about it. No, he's actually challenging, almost commanding, put it to the test. And the only way to do that is, again, not epistemically in my mind, but ontologically in how I live.
Yes.
And that will begin to change. Because I, like a lot of people who grew up in the more conservative sort of stem of Christianity, was told what to think.
Yeah.
And that thought process often came into conflict with what
you experienced
in reality. Experienced in reality. I'm like,
right.
But wait. Like, how am I not... I want to love these people, even though they don't believe or think the same way about me on these things. And it was through that experience that changed my thought process. And I think a lot of people here at Suncoast have had that experience. Because we're taught that this is wrong and that's wrong. Of the 613 laws that you guys talked about, there's some pretty strange ones in there.
Oh, yeah.
That, like don't boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Right. Like that was a command. That's one of the 613.
Yeah.
And I go, I never really had a fascination to do that. I really never had a temptation to boil a goat. Yeah. And the way that most conservative Christians will frame those is, well, some were ritual laws and some were civil laws and some were moral laws. But the Bible doesn't differentiate between them as being particular categories of law. And so that's where I go, that's where experience comes into play. That's where living it out comes into play.
Exactly.
And this is where I get into arguments with people about, like, even the idea of, like, homosexuality. Like, well, but the Old Testament says that Leviticus 19. And I go, yeah, like, let's have a conversation about that, because what I experience in life is that there's absolutely nothing wrong with a person who has that particular sexual orientation. And no, because their thought is attempting to drive the life and not the reverse. And, it's funny, man, even guys who I consider great friends who are atheists, their thought drives that denial, you know? But after like the third or fourth beer, dude,
you wonder if they're really truly atheists.
I don't know. They're like, I don't know, man. This is my my intelligentsia, right? I call it like the psychobabble of academia.
Yeah.
Like, we can talk about ontic phenomenology and all these different philosophical ideas of existentialism, but at the end of the day, how are you going to live? Like, how are you going to live your life? Is it one that is inclusive, or one that is based upon an exclusivity because of certain positions?
Yeah, these are in, those are out.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So what do you do as a pastor who has this very, sort of avant-garde theology, right, that is absolutely universal and inclusive of God's love, when you have someone approach you and say, but I thought I was supposed to, like, ask Jesus into my heart. I thought that I had to call on the name of God to be saved. Like, they live their life within that sort of paradigm of a type of fear, a type of certainty of these theological ideas. What would you say to someone who comes, even at Suncoast, who came to you and said, well, Brad, I thought I was supposed to do this. I thought I was supposed to say these things and believe these things in order to be saved.
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with, if somebody comes to me and talks about their conversion experience, okay, that's one experience. But if you notice in your life that having that experience, as profound as it might have been, as tearful as it might have been, or as ecstatic as it might have been, that you then might slip into old habits and patterns of living, and right? I don't have to know you very well to know that that's true in your life, right? So then do you have to go back to that moment, and so then doctrines have to be built around that, once saved, always saved in some groups, and that sort of thing. But when you really dive into the teachings of Jesus, you see that what he's really addressing is, and we've talked about this in other Sundays, that he's really talking about an illusion of separateness between ourselves and God. So Ryan and I were talking this morning about this drawing that I did that's based on something that Jonathan Pajot, who's a Orthodox artist, icon, sculptor, and very elaborate, symbolism there. And one of the symbols there is this fig tree, and it's the fig tree that they took figs in the garden story and tried to cover themselves after they had sinned and felt separated. And he said, Ryan is our son, and he's a graphic artist. He said, you should put a crack all the way down the middle of that fig tree that they tried to cover themselves with, because that's the illusion. I said, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
The same thing happened in the temple.
Yeah.
According to the Gospels, when Jesus died, the curtain that separated people from the Holy of Holies, where the very presence of God existed, tore from the top to the bottom.
Yeah, that's good.
So what Jesus, the revelation that Jesus brings to bear on humanity is that, look, you're living by an illusion. You think, or Paul said it. He said, before you were separated in your minds from God. In your minds.
That's right.
Pointing out that it's not that you were actually separated. From God's perspective, you weren't separated. It was from your perspective. So that's where I would steer them, is in some kind of direction like that.
That's right. And that's going to play really nice into like this Sunday as we kick off the Summer at the Movies. Where we're going to, this Sunday it's Top Gun, Talk to Me Goose. And the idea of how do we hear that voice of God, right? Mm-hmm. And I've, as mystical as I am or want to be, I've never heard God with my ears. Mm-hmm. I've heard God with my heart. I've heard God with my mind. And those are very different ways into how we need to sort of situate ourselves in order to understand how God speaks. Because I believe God still speaks today, and that and speaks pretty clearly. But the question is always, are we listening? Or is that yeast even blocking the heart and mind?
Is it making your mind foggy?
That's right. And so that's going to be really interesting as we get into that, man. It's going to be good.
For sure. I'm looking forward to it.
It'll be fun. Well, I appreciate you being here, Pastor Brett. Thanks for joining us, man.
Love it.